Hi everyone, and welcome to another edition of Burkhead's Bullpen here on MajorLeagueFishing.com. I'm Lynn Burkhead with Ott DeFoe, and Otter as I call you. I hope you don't get mad at me calling you Otter.
Not at all. I like it.
You know, we talk an awful lot about warm weather fishing here at Major League Fishing because our events happen in the warmer months of the year, but you guys get your Elite Series started in the colder time of the year, and sometimes there are even tournaments or just fun fishing when it's just really cold. So I thought maybe if it's okay with you, we talk about some coldwater cranking today.
Yeah, that's something I really like to do. And our Bassmaster Classic, since I've started fishing the Elite Series, has always been in February. And I enjoy fishing that time of year, and the weather, you never know what you're going to get, but the fishing can be really, really good if you know how to adapt and know some things to try.
Of course, cold weather cranking was kind of a misnomer at this last Classic, more like Arctic cranking at the last Classic, 10 degrees on that opening morning and below freezing each morning. Going in early 2016, going to Grand Lake. There was some cold weather and snow the previous visit to Grand Lake. When we're filming this, you're very much in the mix for heading to Grand Lake, so it could be the difference, a career difference maker for you, knowing how to cold water crank. So how do you do it?
For me, it's about using a bait that matches the conditions, and in cold weather, the fish are more sluggish. So you're never going to use a bait that you're going to be burning back to the boat. It's going to be a bait that you fish a little bit slower, and something that doesn't float up real fast. And that's something you can actually make the bait change. You can add weight to it, whether it's suspend strips or larger hooks, to make that bait have a more neutral buoyancy. Not quite a suspending jerk bait. I still want it to float, but whenever you hit something, you don't want it to immediately bounce back up like a square bill does, for example. So a tighter wiggling bait, a more natural bait, and a slower rising bait are some of the characteristics you want in it. That tight wiggling bait is, to me, the most important of all of those features. The other things really can help the bait excel, but it has to be a tight wiggling bait in cold weather.
Now, when I think of cold weather fishing, the first bait I think of is one that you mentioned, the jerk bait. So what is going to separate, in your mind, when to use the jerk bait, when to use the deeper crank?
For me, they can be side by side. They can be simultaneously. Where I'm fishing these type of banks, I'm actually throwing a crankbait, and then these kind of banks are the places where I'm throwing, a jerk bait. So it's just being able to distinguish one pattern from the other. Grand Lake, for example, whenever we fished there last time, if I was fishing around boat docks, I would catch fish on a jerk bait. But whenever I'd actually get up on the shoreline, a crankbait was better for me to get more bites. So it was kind of about figuring out which one worked where and which windows were better for which one. Sometimes the morning bite will be extremely good with the jerk bait, and the afternoon is better for the crankbait. So it's not like you can say, okay, the water temperature is this, the clouds are this, blah, 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 blah. This is the one that's going to be better. And the only general rule of thumb I would add to that, when I would pick one more over the other, is in really clear water. I'm going to go with the jerk bait. Stuff with more than 4 feet of visibility, the crankbait kind of goes away. It's primarily a fairly stained water deal, from a foot to 3 to 4 feet of visibility. You get much clearer than that, and you're just not going to get a lot of bites unless you get a cloudy, windy, overcast kind of day. Then the crankbait can be as effective as a jerk bait, but most of the time I'm going to fish a jerk bait in those clear water environments.
What type of rod, what type of reel, what type of line are you going to throw?
For me, the primary bait I'm going to cold water crank with is a Shad Wrap, a wrapless Shad Wrap. From a size 5, 6, or 7, and even on occasion I'll go up to 8 if I'm really targeting large fish. But that 5, 6, and 7, I'm going to throw those on a spinning rod. And that you see somebody throwing a crankbait on a spinning rod, you immediately it just looks weird. You don't expect it, but it's the most efficient way to fish it. And that's for a tournament angler. If you're making fouled up casts, if the bait's not going as far as it should, or if you're getting backlashes, you need to adjust something, because there's no loss of pride in throwing a crankbait on a spinning rod. It's just more efficient. You make more accurate, better presentations, longer casts, all those kind of things with that small, lightweight of a bait on a spinning rod. So that's why I choose to use that. The line for me is going to be either 6 or 8 pound test fluorocarbon. I like the Berkeley Trilene fluorocarbon. They actually have a formula that's made for spinning reels. It's an extra limp version of their fluorocarbon line, a little smaller diameter, and like I said, a spinning rod, a 6.5, 6 foot 9 inch spinning rod, something like that, and a size 20 spinning reel. Using a slightly smaller spinning reel, it's a little bit slower gear ratio. The bigger the reel, the bigger the spool, the more line you take up every time you turn the handle. And it's hard to fish that. It's hard to slow that bait down enough with a really big spinning reel. So go with a little bit smaller spinning reel, and it'll be easier to fish that bait slowly and get more bites. And for me, that's going to be a Fluger reel and a Fenwick rod.
Now, getting more bites is one part of the equation, but the other part of the equation is finishing those bites off. With the very light fluorocarbon line, with the spinning tackle that you're utilizing, probably a pretty lengthy fight to get these fish back to the boat, right?
It can be, but if the water's extremely cold, a lot of times those fish are pretty sluggish. Now, you start getting up into that, and I'm going to throw a Shad Wrap all the way up till the water gets close to 60, if the conditions are what fit the bait. So you start getting in that 50, 55 degree range, and yeah, those fish have a lot of spunk to them. Now, the ones you catch for the most part in 40, 45 degrees, I mean, they may pull hard for just a little bit, but they're pretty sluggish. So it's not too big of a worry. But yeah, you start getting in that warmer, slightly warmer water of the cold water cranking aspect, and yeah, you can have a true battle on your hands, and especially if you're on a lake that has smallmouth in it, like a lot of the lakes do where I live. You hook a 4.5 or 5 pound smallmouth, and you got a battle on your hands. That's all you can do to get them in.
The classic in 2015 was Hartwell, southeastern part of the country, and you get lakes like Lanier and other lakes that have blueback herring.
Yeah.
They can be a player in the wintertime. A lot of times, though, out in the west, in my part of the world where you guys are coming to, I live in North Texas, you guys are going for the classic to northeastern Oklahoma. They're shad lakes.
Yep.
And shad sometimes aren't a big player. There can be big shad die-offs in the wintertime.
Right.
So what type of color? Are you going to go with shad color, or are you going to go with a crawfish pattern?
It depends a little on the watercolor, but primarily on whatever I think the fish are feeding on. If I see it being primarily a crawfish deal, if some of the fish I catch, have crawdads in them, if I see that and I'm not really catching the fish relating to bait fish, then I'm going to go with crawdad colors. Now, if I'm catching those fish really around places that have to, that I'm seeing schools of bait on the graph or actually in the water, even in cold water, a lot of times those bait fish will get up pretty shallow, especially on sunny banks. If I'm seeing the fish I'm catching are around bait fish, then I'm going to be more apt to switch to a bait fish color. But if I'm catching those fish just fishing on rocky banks, especially sunny rocky banks, I'm probably going to go with a crawdad color at that point.
A couple of last questions. We're in the wintertime. That's what we're talking about. We're talking about cold water cranking. So the water's going to be cold. The fish are going to be a little bit more on the sluggish side. Does a cold front have as much effect on a wintertime bass that's already in cold water as it does, say, in the spring or the fall when we're talking about fluctuating water temperatures?
It certainly can, but it's actually not so much the cold front as it is the fact that it was a front. You get a front that comes in, and a lot of times that can be some of the most unbelievable fishing, even in the winter when the water is extremely cold. But once that front passes and the wind dies, it gets to be just really, really hard to get a bite. I mean, it can be extremely tough, and that was kind of what happened the last time we fished at Grand. For me, that was how I caught a lot of my fish, was on a Shad Wrap. And the first day I caught 25 or 30 keepers. It was just everywhere I went, I caught fish, no problem at all. The second day, it was hard to get a bite. I think I went from catching 20-something to 10 or 11, which was still more than a limit, but not near the size, not near the number of bites. It really got a lot tougher. Then on the third day, we had a little bit of wind again. Those fish showed right back up. So it certainly wasn't that I caught them all. It was just that those fish, they just kind of tightened up. That weather change really turned them off a little bit. So that's more of what it is. It's not the fact that the water temperature, the surface temperature goes down 2 degrees or it goes up 2 degrees. It's the fact that that front passes and the high pressure and those type of systems move through. You get low pressure in the wintertime, and it can blow your mind what happens on those water and just how shallow those fish will get on a lot of occasions. That's actually something I'd like to touch on there. Wintertime fishing. I use an underwater camera quite a bit, and not just in the wintertime, but I've played with it a lot in the winter as well. And I think that it would surprise most people to know that the water on just a normal day, if you go out at 10 o'clock during the day, not even in the afternoon once it's warmed up some, if you go out in the middle of the day, that surface temperature is actually as warm, or usually 2 or 3 degrees warmer than it is 10 feet down and 15 feet down and 20 feet down. It's just like air. The heat rises in that particular situation, and that surface temperature is the warmest water, except for very first thing in the morning when you've had a really cold night. And then it knocks it back down, and that stuff down there 10 or 15 degrees or 10 or 15 feet is actually warmer. That very top layer of the water is actually the warmest part. So don't think that fish can't be shallow in warm water or in cold water, because a lot of times that's the warmest water they've got.
Yep. You touched on this briefly, and the last thing I wanted to ask you was you talked about catching a good number of fish. I've always thought that cold weather bass fishing can produce some of the biggest fish of the year.
Absolutely.
Have you had some great memories of cold weather cranking?
Oh yeah, the very first big smallmouth I ever caught, and that was over a 4-pounder, was at home fishing a tournament with my dad, and the water, I can remember we were fishing on Fort Loudon Lake there near Knoxville, and I caught one. It wasn't actually on a Shad Wrap, but a very similar small homemade crankbait that would only run about 3 feet deep, and I caught it on a bluff, so it was on a place where that fish could vertically change depths and not have to swim any distance at all. That's usually a key in the wintertime, cold weather kind of cranking stuff. And there was actually a log extending out into the water, and I made a cast across that, and somehow it didn't get hung, but it was like a 4.5-pound smallmouth ate that little crankbait, and the water was 43 degrees and had about that much visibility. So that was kind of something. I mean, it was a long time ago, and it was I think one of 2 fish we caught that whole day, but that fish, I can still remember it just like it was yesterday. I could drive you to right where it was, on the lake. But it was a fish that made an impression on me of catching a fish that size on a bait that small and water that cold. So it was kind of all those aspects together that, really hit home, and something I've never forgotten.
Well, when Ott DeFoe doesn't forget something, it's because it's pretty unique and pretty special. A lot of people put their rods and reels up in the wintertime and they wait for spring. That can be a big mistake in a lot of parts of bass country. For more on wintertime bass fishing tips and techniques and the personalities of Major League Fishing like Ott DeFoe, go to MajorLeagueFishing.com.